The FBI never stops looking. If someone commits a crime, if they flee justice, the FBI will find them. The fugitives currently on the 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list are wanted for the following crimes: conspiracy to distribute and possess with intent to conspiracy to provide and conceal material support and resources to terrorists, narco-terrorism conspiracy, racketeering conspiracy known as RICO, possession of machine guns, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, commit money laundering, alien smuggling conspiracy. Murder should be considered armed and dangerous, extremely dangerous. Reward for sharing information leading to their arrest and or conviction of up to $250,000, of up to $5 million, of up to $10 million. Most Wanted Fugitives list is known as the collection of the worst of the worst. If you know something, please report a tip so you can help us catch them.
So you know how this is going to go?
Vaguely. You're going to give me an envelope. I'm going to open it. I will look at it. I will show it to the camera, and I will talk about it. So Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden, of course, was put on the top 10 list in 1999 in connection with the bombings of our U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. He, of course, was one of the principal leaders of the terrorist group known as Al-Qaeda, and he was put on the list before the 9/11 attacks, which is what we remember him mostly for. We use the U instead of the O that he's more commonly associated with because of the way our transliteration of his name in Arabic, which was his native language. The FBI had been looking for bin Laden for many years, working very closely with our law enforcement, intelligence, and foreign partners to track bin Laden down, especially after the 9/11 attacks. The reward for information leading to the capture and arrest of bin Laden was offered at up to $25 million. Now, of course, because it was U.S. Armed Services personnel who found bin Laden and killed him, they did not receive the reward. They were doing their job. Over the years, a number of terrorists had been placed on the 10 Most Wanted list. Starting in the 1970s, we had special editions for members of the Weather Underground, a group that was blowing up improvised explosive devices in major places around the country. And after that, in the 1990s, we had others, the perpetrator of the Centennial Olympic Park bombing and other bombings. So certainly over time, we had terrorists on the lists. Bin Laden, of course, was the most well-known of those. Eric Starvo Galt. This is actually not Eric Starvo Galt. That's a name that was assumed by a criminal named James Earl Ray. He was put on the list in 1968 because he assassinated Dr. Martin Luther King. Ray had assumed the name Galt after escaping from prison. He had been convicted of a number of crimes over the years. He had served several prison sentences and even escaped several times at that point. But in 1967, when he escaped from prison, he remained out of law enforcement hands for about a year and had come up with the plan to assassinate Dr. King. Ray took on the name Galt in part to cover his path and to allow him to put together the plan that he had for shooting King. After murdering King in Memphis, he fled north, eventually arriving in Canada and then flying over to Europe. He was tracked down to London and then to Portugal. And when he returned from Portugal, because he was trying to get to North Africa, he was toying with the idea of perhaps becoming a mercenary, and he was looking for a way to continue to avoid being found. The FBI, working with the United Kingdom police, was able to secure his arrest and then extradited back to the United States to face charges in the murder of Dr. King.
Something similar to that.
Well, this is an early. Yes, of course. Ray also holds the distinction of being one of the few people actually placed on the 10 Most Wanted list twice. In 1977, he escaped from a prison in Tennessee with a number of other inmates, and he was quickly found by law enforcement officers in nearby woods. But between the time that he escaped and the time of his capture, the FBI had placed him again on the Most Wanted list as an emergency ad, given the notoriety of Ray's case and the fact that he had escaped from prison yet again.
What do you make of the theories that Ray did actually not kill Dr. King?
Certainly all the evidence that the FBI compiled, from fingerprints to tracking Ray's movements and everything else, shows that Ray was guilty of the murders. His later recantations and some of the other conspiracy theories that have grown up around it simply don't hold up in the face of that evidence. It was only later that he began to tell different stories about all of it, and other allegations that perhaps there were others involved popped up. As far as FBI investigation showed, Ray seems to have put this together by himself, and that anybody who had interacted with him in the course of whether it was buying his gun or renting a room so that he would have a view of where Dr. King was, or researching Dr. King's movements, were all things that were done specifically by Ray. They weren't done by others. Yasser Abdel Saeed, in 2014, he killed his two daughters, a 17-year-old and an 18-year-old. Saeed was a taxi driver in Texas, and on the night that his daughters were murdered, he had picked them up. They were in the back seat of his cab, and then later the cab was found with the two girls shot multiple times in the back seat. Saeed was not to be found and was the immediate suspect, both in their disappearance and murder. The brutality of the murder and the shock was something that catapulted his name to the top of our considerations. We searched for him for a number of years. In fact, he had disappeared fairly completely, it seemed. But we kept at it. And it turned out that he was, in fact, being helped by a son and another relative to hide from law enforcement. But it was the publicity from the Most Wanted list that actually led us to find him. A maintenance worker in the apartment complex where he was staying had gone to do a repair in an apartment and noticed Saeed, and informed law enforcement. That allowed us to continue an investigation to determine that it actually was him. And although he tried to escape again, we got him. Both of Saeed's family members, his brother and his son, were sentenced to significant jail terms, one to 10 years and the other to 12 years in prison. Samuel and Earl Veeney were added to the 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list in 1965. They were both natives of Maryland, living up in Baltimore at the time, and were involved in robbing a liquor store up there with several other people. Confronted by a police officer, Samuel shot the officer and seriously wounded him. And very soon after that, the brothers again were confronted, and in this case, the officer actually was fatally wounded. A couple of weeks later, we were able to track them down thankfully to a tip from a citizen up in New York. They had both taken jobs up there and were working in a factory-type situation, and we were able to bring them to justice and to face the charges for the murder and attack on the other police officer, as well as the robbery. They were sentenced to death, although the sentences were commuted in the 1970s to life imprisonment. Earl tragically killed himself in jail. Samuel spent the rest of his life in prison for the crimes that he had committed. The unique aspect of this case, and it's not entirely unique, but it shows that some of our top tenors have been related. In this case, we had two brothers who were placed on the Most Wanted Fugitives list. Samuel was placed on it first because of the evidence of his role in the shootings directly, and Earl was placed on as soon as we had another opening on the list, and actually ended up being placed on the list only a couple of days before we were able to identify where the two were and get their arrests. Theodore Robert Bundy is, of course, one of our more well-known serial killers. He was actually put on the list at the time in 1978 because he had escaped while actually being tried for one of those murders. At the time, it wasn't known that he was a serial killer, but he had been found and arrested for a murder in Colorado. And Bundy had chosen to represent himself. He had been a law student for a couple of years. As his own defense, he was given the ability to use the court's law library. And at the time, he was in doing some of the research work to provide his own defense. He was not watched very well in the library, and he was not shackled. He snuck out and traveled from Colorado across the states to the east and ended up in Florida, committing a series of murders as he went along, including the murder of two sorority sisters in a Florida university. In this case, a local officer in Florida actually pulled Bundy over because he was speeding and recognized that his alibis weren't terribly good, and that his alias that he was using was not good either. And based on the information that the FBI had been putting out about Bundy across the nation, realized who they had. The FBI actually sent agents to interview him, because at the time we were looking at what we could learn about the phenomenon, the motives, the psychology, the practices of serial killers. And it was the early beginnings of our behavioral analysis units. It was the early development of psychological profiling, and it has played a strong role in our work since. It has become obviously very well known through our popular culture, but it remains a practice of trying to look at the behaviors of criminals shown through the evidence left at their crime scenes.
It seems like even though he's on the FBI list, he's actually not being charged with a federal crime.
We shouldn't assume that people who are put on the Most Wanted Fugitives list are being sought by the FBI based on our own investigations. The definition of a fugitive basically sets a federal crime for escaping from or avoiding legitimate law enforcement proceedings. And so a violent criminal who is being charged in state courts can be sought as a federal fugitive. William Francis Sutton. He's one of my favorites. He was the 11th addition to the 10 Most Wanted list, so he was the first ad after the original 10 when we started 75 years ago. Willie Sutton was known as the Actor, or Slick Willie, because when he would rob banks or other places, would often wear a disguise. He might dress up as a postman, or he would dress up as a police officer. Sutton was known as something of a gentleman robber. He would be quite polite, at least as far as his demands and so forth went, although obviously making it serious enough that people believed him and were willing to unwilling to risk their safety or life by refusing his demands. Although we added him to the list in the 1950s, he'd been in federal prison and local prison since the 1930s and had escaped at least 6 times. In fact, it was in relation to his 6th escape, which had happened about 2 years before he was added to the list, that we went after Sutton. Now, Willie, of course, was eventually captured, and he's known because when he was asked, "Why do you rob banks?" he said, "Well, that's because that's where the money is." He was paroled in the 1960s. He moved to Florida and actually took up a career as an actor, among other things, finally passing away in 1980. So he had served his time, and as far as we know, didn't commit any other crimes that came to our attention. Eric Franklin Rosser is the first child pornographer to be posted to the Most Wanted Fugitives list. He was sought because he had produced a video involving child pornography in Thailand and then shared it with someone in Indiana, and of course had other child pornography and trafficking issues against him. He was indicted but fled the country. The FBI was able to track him down to Thailand eventually because of tips from the Most Wanted program. And working with our partners in Thai law enforcement, we were able to identify Rosser there and have him extradited back to the United States to face charges. He was jailed for a number of years before being paroled out, and then arrested within a couple of weeks again for child pornography charges, and remains in jail today. Rosser was professionally a musician, and in fact had worked for rock star John Mellencamp for a time at one point. Over the years, though, had gone back and forth in a number of different positions, and it was his role in producing and distributing child pornography that brought him to the FBI's attention. Alejandro Castillo is one of the youngest people ever put on the 10 Most Wanted list. At the time of the crime he is alleged to have committed, he was 17 years old. He had been dating a woman he worked with, and they had broken up, but he owed her some money. In August of 2016, he contacted her through a text message and said he wanted to pay it back. After apparently getting together with her, he is alleged to have forced her to withdraw a significant portion of money from her ATM account, and then Castillo disappeared. Her body was found in the woods, and her car was eventually found in Arizona. Border Patrol footage shows that Castillo and an accomplice crossed the border into Mexico. And certainly at the time we thought that he was still there, and potentially is still there today. The current reward for information leading to the identification and arrest of Castillo is up to $250,000. If you do have an idea of where or what he might be doing, please contact us through tips.fbi.gov. Eric Robert Rudolph is a domestic terrorist. In 1996, he placed a bomb at the Centennial Park where the opening ceremonies for the Olympic Games in Atlanta, Georgia were going on, and it exploded, killing one person. Rudolph was not immediately identified, though, at the time. It was the next year, after the bombing of several other places, that he was placed on the Most Wanted Fugitives list. At that point, he had been connected with multiple bombings and terrorist acts, and was thought to be in the woods of North Carolina. And in fact, although he was known to be a noted outdoorsman, it was only when a local police officer noticed a man rummaging through a dumpster in a local behind a local restaurant that Rudolph was found. And it turns out that he had, over the years, been hiding in the woods, in caves, and other places that he knew well. He kept as aware of the investigation as he could. In fact, it's pretty clear that he had at one point even contemplated bombing the law enforcement task force that was seeking him. And he actually had a store of dynamite that he had hidden that he could have used for that. Although the Olympic Park bombing was the first bomb that Rudolph set off, soon after he also bombed several gay nightclubs as well as 2 abortion clinics. Rudolph was arrested and charged with all of these bombings, and so his conviction is for all of these and will serve the rest of his life in jail. James J. Bulger, or Whitey Bulger as he was known, was a noted, infamous Boston mobster. He led the Winter Hill Gang through the 1970s and 80s and 90s. And he's notorious not simply because of all the crimes that were committed by him and his gang, but also because during much of that period into the 90s, he had been serving as a top echelon organized crime informant for the FBI. Bulger had been recruited by an FBI agent to inform on the Italian mafia in Boston. It was thought that the Italian mafia, being the principal organized criminal enterprise in Boston, the most powerful, was the more significant, and that Bulger's supposedly smaller crimes might be ignored for a time, since he was providing such good intelligence about the other mobsters. It turns out, of course, he was committing many serious crimes throughout this period. And in fact, when he became a fugitive in the 1990s, it was on account of multiple murders that his gang had committed and he had been involved in. Eventually, the agent who had been managing him as an informant was convicted of aiding and abetting in these actions as well. Bulger, though, had disappeared. The FBI sought him for many years, even as he got older, and despite his age, he was still considered armed and dangerous. And it was, in fact, a renewal of our effort to bring attention to Bulger as someone on the most wanted fugitives list that eventually led to the tips, the citizen tips that helped us to identify him. Bulger had fled with his girlfriend, Catherine Grieg, and they were eventually tracked down to California. And it was some of the information about the couple that allowed people in the area where they were staying to realize that those 2 people who kind of kept to themselves actually might be these wanted fugitives. In Grieg's case, I think it had to do with her regular use of hair salons, among other things. But it's these sorts of details about people that can stick out in our minds and that bring a recognition and a connection between the pictures and the information and the situation and just the idea that maybe something's not quite right there. And in this case, Bulger was able to be brought to justice. He was sentenced for his crimes to life imprisonment, and he was sent to federal penitentiary, where he was killed by a fellow inmate several years later. One of our earlier listees told our agents when we arrested him that when you put me on the list and I read about it in the newspaper, I knew it was only a matter of time before you got me. Help us make that so.